Chapter 1. Death at the Garden Party. It was one of those perfect English summer afternoons that seem to exist only in memory and occasionally, as if by some special dispensation in reality. The gardens of Westholme Manor stretched out in all their glory, a testament to the meticulous care of generations of gardeners and the considerable wealth of the Westholme family. Lady Westholme's annual garden party was, as always, the social event of the season in the village of St. Mary Mead. The lawns were dotted with ladies in floral dresses and wide-brimmed hats, gentlemen in summer suits, all partaking of refreshments served by uniformed staff, moving discreetly between the guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in a comfortable garden chair beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree. Though she appeared to be nothing more than a sweet elderly lady enjoying the spectacle, her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She noted the slight tension in Lady Westholme's smile as she greeted Mrs. Bancroft, the wealthy philanthropist, whose recent charitable endeavors had made her something of a local celebrity. "More tea, Miss Marple?" asked the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, pausing beside her with a plate of delicate sandwiches. "Oh, thank you, dear," Miss Marple replied, accepting a cucumber sandwich. "Such a lovely party, isn't it? Though I do think Mrs. Bancroft seems a little out of sorts today." Mrs. Clement followed Miss Marple's gaze to where Mrs. Bancroft stood, resplendent in an expensive blue dress that matched her distinctive personal teacup, a piece of fine china she was known to carry to social events due to some peculiar superstition. "Poor thing has had rather a difficult time lately," Mrs. Clement murmured. "All that business with her will, you know, causing quite the stir among her relatives." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Village gossip had a way of reaching her ears, and she knew all about Mrs. Bancroft's decision to leave her considerable fortune to establish a children's hospital, rather than to her expectant family members. "I believe her nephew Richard is over there," Miss Marple observed, glancing toward a handsome young man engaged in animated conversation with Lady Westholme's daughter. "He doesn't look particularly pleased, does he?" Before Mrs. Clement could respond, there was a commotion near the refreshment table. Mrs. Bancroft had suddenly risen from her seat, her face contorted in pain. The distinctive blue teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the flagstone terrace. "Is there a doctor present?" called Lady Westholme, her voice cutting through the sudden hush that had fallen over the party. Dr. Haydock, who had been enjoying a glass of Lady Westholme's excellent lemonade, hurried forward. Miss Marple watched as he knelt beside Mrs. Bancroft, who had now collapsed onto the lawn. There was something troubling about the scene, something that nagged at Miss Marple's observant mind. She rose from her chair with the aid of her stick and made her way slowly toward the growing circle of onlookers. As she approached, she noticed a curious thing. The broken pieces of the blue teacup lay scattered on the flagstones, but Miss Marple was certain, absolutely certain, that she had seen Mrs. Bancroft drinking from a different cup just moments before. Dr. Haydock looked up, his face grave. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced quietly. "She's gone." A ripple of shock passed through the assembled guests. "Death at Lady Westholme's garden party. It was unthinkable." "What happened, Doctor?" Lady Westholme asked, her voice steady, despite the circumstances. "Impossible to say without a proper examination," Dr. Haydock replied, "but the symptoms suggest some form of poison." At this pronouncement, the murmurs grew louder. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the faces of those nearest to her. Richard Bancroft, looking pale but composed. Miss Simmons, Mrs. Bancroft's companion, clutching her handkerchief to her mouth. Lady Westholme herself, maintaining a dignified calm, and her daughter a doctor at the local hospital, who was frowning thoughtfully at the broken teacup. Inspector Slack would no doubt be called, and he would conduct his investigation with his usual efficiency and his usual tendency to overlook the most illuminating details. But Miss Marple, observing the scene with her lifetime of experience in the study of human nature, knew that the truth lay in that switched teacup, the one Mrs. Bancroft had been drinking from just before her collapse. As the guests were ushered inside to await the arrival of the police, Miss Marple lingered near the broken china. Something very sinister had occurred in these beautiful gardens on this perfect summer day, and somehow that blue teacup was at the heart of it all. Chapter 2: The Charitable Bequest. The morning after the garden party dawned with a peculiar grayness that seemed to match the mood in St. Mary Mead. News of Mrs. Bancroft's sudden death had spread through the village with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, each retelling, adding subtle embellishments, until the story had achieved almost mythical proportions. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, the morning newspaper spread before her, though her thoughts were far from the printed words. She was recalling every detail of the previous day's events, with the precision that had so often proved invaluable in matters of this sort. The memory of that teacup, the way it had been exchanged, nagged at her persistently. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her contemplation. It was her dear friend, Dolly Bantry, breathless with the latest development. "Jane, have you heard about Mrs. Bancroft's will? It's caused the most tremendous upset." Miss Marple made appropriate noises of interest, though she suspected she knew what was coming. "She's left everything, mind you, to establish some children's hospital. Not a penny to her family. Poor Richard was counting on that inheritance to save his business, and Miss Simmons has been her faithful companion for 15 years without so much as a thank you. And then there's her sister. They hadn't spoken in years, but blood is thicker than water, as they say." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple, pouring herself another cup of tea. "And when was this will made, do you know?" "That's just it. Only last month. Her solicitor, Miss Petherick, is being terribly discreet, but his clerk plays bridge with my gardener's wife, and apparently Mrs. Bancroft was most insistent about the change, said she'd found a worthier cause than her ungrateful relations." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. A worthier cause. I wonder what she meant by that precisely. "Well, it's this new children's wing at the hospital that everyone's been fundraising for. Lady Westholm's son-in-law is to be the head of it, I understand. Dr. Gramey, you remember him, married Elizabeth Westholm last spring. They say he's brilliant, though I always find him rather cold." After finishing her conversation with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple decided a visit to the village would be in order. St. Mary Mead's main street was unusually busy that morning. Outside the post office, a small crowd had gathered, their voices hushed but animated. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Miss Weatherby, one of the village's most reliable sources of information. "Have you heard about the threatening letters?" "Threatening letters?" echoed Miss Marple, her interest immediately piqued. Mrs. Bancroft had been receiving them for weeks, apparently. Inspector Slack found them in her desk when they searched the house. Most unpleasant, they say. Miss Marple considered this new information as she continued toward the solicitor's office. Petherick had been her own legal adviser for many years, and while he was indeed discreet in professional matters, he occasionally made exceptions for Miss Marple, whose insights he had learned to value. The bell above the door tinkled softly as she entered the cool, paper-scented office. Petherick greeted her warmly, though the lines around his eyes betrayed his weariness. "A distressing business, this affair with Mrs. Bancroft," he said, gesturing for Miss Marple to take a seat. "I suppose you've come about the will, everyone else has." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I understand there was a recent change, Mr. Petherick nodded, removing his spectacles to polish them with his handkerchief. A habit Miss Marple knew indicated he was choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Bancroft came to see me 4 weeks ago. She was agitated, said she had discovered something that had changed her mind about certain matters. She was determined to amend her will immediately, leaving her entire estate to establish a children's hospital. Did she explain this discovery?" "Not in detail. She mentioned something about justice being served and righting past wrongs. I assumed it was related to her philanthropic interests. Mrs. Bancroft had always been generous to children's charities. As Miss Marple left the solicitor's office, she nearly collided with Richard Bancroft, his handsome face clouded with anger. He muttered an apology, barely seeming to register her presence, as he pushed past her into Mr. Petherick's office. Absolutely disgraceful, she heard him exclaim before the door swung shut behind him. Miss Marple continued her walk, this time toward the small cottage where Miss Simmons, Mrs. Bancroft's companion, had taken temporary residence. The garden was neat but unimaginative, much like Miss Simmons herself, Miss Marple reflected, as the thin, grey-haired woman answered her gentle knock. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "How kind of you to call. Please, come in." The cottage's sitting room was cluttered with cardboard boxes, some half filled with books and ornaments. "You're packing," observed Miss Marple. Miss Simmons' lips tightened. "I have no choice. With Mrs. Bancroft gone and, well, given the circumstances of her will, I find myself without employment or accommodation. 15 years of service, and not so much as a small bequest. It must have come as quite a shock." Indeed, Miss Simmons busied herself with the teapot, her hands trembling slightly. "She changed, you know, these past few weeks. Secretive, making telephone calls when she thought I was out of earshot, going through old papers late into the night. Did she mention anything about threatening letters?" Miss Simmons' hand jerked, spilling tea onto the tray. "Who told you about those? I found the first one myself, hidden beneath her blotter. Horrible things suggesting she had blood on her hands, that she would pay for her silence. Nonsense, of course. Mrs. Bancroft was the soul of integrity. Did she seem frightened by them? Not frightened, no. Determined. That was when she began her investigations." "Investigations?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Into that business at the hospital. A young nurse died quite suddenly. Natural causes, they said. But Mrs. Bancroft wasn't convinced. She'd met the girl once at a fundraising event and taken a liking to her. As Miss Marple left the cottage, she encountered Dr. Haydock heading toward his surgery. He greeted her with a distracted nod. "Just on my way to complete the post-mortem report," he explained. "Most peculiar case. The symptoms suggest a plant-based toxin, something quite rare. I've sent samples to London for analysis." "I understand there was some confusion about the teacup," Miss Marple said carefully. Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Only that I noticed Mrs. Bancroft was drinking from an ordinary white teacup just before she collapsed, yet it was the broken blue one beside her afterward. Are you certain of this, Miss Marple?" "Quite certain, and there's something else. Mrs. Bancroft had been investigating the death of a young nurse at the hospital, a death that was perhaps not as natural as it seemed." Dr. Haydock's expression grew grave. "Nurse Fletcher? A tragedy? Heart failure, they said. She was under Dr. Graham's care at the time." "Dr. Graham, Lady Westholm's son-in-law. Brilliant doctor, by all accounts, though I've had my reservations about some of his diagnoses. Too quick sometimes. Too convenient." As Miss Marple made her way home, she passed the village green where Mrs. Bancroft's estranged sister, newly arrived from London, was engaged in animated conversation with Lady Westholm. Despite their apparent differences, both women were dressed in elegant morning clothes, their faces composed into expressions of appropriate solemnity. Yet there was a tension between them that spoke of more than mere family estrangement. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she pondered the scattered pieces of the puzzle. The changed will, the threatening letters, the mysterious death of Nurse Fletcher, the switched teacup, and running through it all, the golden thread of motive. Who stood to benefit most from Mrs. Bancroft's death? The answer, she suspected, lay not in the obvious disappointment of the disinherited relatives, but in something far more calculated, something connected to that children's hospital and the secrets Mrs. Bancroft had begun to uncover. Chapter 3. The Gardener's Discovery. A fine mist clung to the gardens of Westholme Manor in the pale light of dawn. The dew-laden roses hung their heavy heads, as if in mourning for the tragedy that had unfolded amongst their beauty. Old Jenkins, the head gardener who had tended these grounds for over 40 years, moved with practiced precision among the hedgerows, his weathered hands wielding the shears with the delicacy one might expect from a surgeon rather than a man who had spent his life coaxing beauty from soil. It was in the Italian garden, beneath the shadow of an ancient stone nymph, that Jenkins made his discovery. Later, he would recall the moment with a shiver. How the morning light had caught on something pale, nestled within the immaculately trimmed yew. How his curiosity had led him to part the dense foliage, and how his breath had caught at the sight of the lady's glove, white and delicate, stained with curious dark smudges. Jenkins was a simple man, but not a fool. The events of 2 days prior remained vivid in the village's collective memory, and even he, who typically paid little attention to the affairs of the gentry, knew that any unusual item found on the grounds might hold significance. He carried the glove, pinched carefully between soil-stained fingers, to the kitchen entrance of the manor. The house was subdued, the staff moving with the hushed reverence that follows in death's wake. The glove was placed on Inspector Slack's desk within the hour. Miss Marple learned of the discovery as she trimmed her own roses, a task that afforded her both physical activity and mental clarity. It was her nephew Raymond West, the well-known novelist who happened to be visiting for the weekend, who brought the news. "Aunt Jane," he said, approaching her garden gate with the brisk stride of a man carrying important information. "I've just heard something rather curious. The gardener at Westholme Manor has found a glove near where Mrs. Bancroft collapsed." Miss Marple paused, secateurs hovering over a particularly splendid bloom. "Indeed? How interesting. And what sort of glove might it be?" "A lady's glove, apparently. White kid leather. The curious part is that it's stained with something the police are very interested in, a plant extract of some kind. They've sent it to London for analysis." "A plant extract," Miss Marple repeated softly, her pale eyes distant with thought. "How very significant." Raymond smiled indulgently at his aunt. He had long ago learned to respect her insights, though he still occasionally found her methods quaint. "The other interesting thing is that the glove doesn't seem to belong to anyone at the party. At least, no one is claiming it." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and removed her gardening gloves. "I think perhaps a visit to Dr. Haydock might be in order. Would you be kind enough to drive me, Raymond?" Dr. Haydock's surgery was located in a handsome Victorian house on the edge of the village. He greeted Miss Marple with a warmth that spoke of their long acquaintance and mutual respect. "I was hoping you might call," he said, ushering them into his study. "I've just had the results back from London regarding Mrs. Bancroft's toxicology. The poison was derived from a rather uncommon plant, Aconitum napellus." "Monkshood," said Miss Marple, nodding. "I have some in my garden, though I'm always very careful with it. Beautiful flowers, but deadly if mishandled." "Precisely. And the same substance was found on the glove Jenkins discovered, a highly concentrated extract, far more potent than anything one might accidentally encounter." "Suggesting deliberate preparation," murmured Miss Marple. "Exactly so. The question is, whose glove is it? It's rather fine. Good quality kid leather, with a small pearl button at the wrist. Lady Westholme has denied. It belongs to any of her guests, and it's certainly too small for most of the gentlemen." "Might I see it?" Dr. Haydock hesitated. "It's evidence in a murder investigation now, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack would have my head." "Oh, I don't need to touch it, just to look. Sometimes these little details can be so informative." With a resigned sigh, Dr. Haydock unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a paper evidence bag. Through the clear plastic window, Miss Marple could see the glove. Elegant indeed, but with a curious discoloration across the fingertips. You see the staining? Dr. Haydock said. That's where the poison was concentrated. Whoever wore this glove likely handled the toxin directly. Miss Marple studied it thoughtfully. The poison was in the teacup, wasn't it? The blue one that Mrs. Bancroft always used. So it would appear there were trace amounts found in the broken pieces. But not, I imagine, in the white teacup. Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply. What white teacup? Miss Marple explained her observation from the garden party, how Mrs. Bancroft had been drinking from a standard white cup moments before her collapse. That's most interesting, Dr. Haydock said, frowning. The police only recovered fragments of the blue cup. If there was a switch, as you suggest, then the poisoned cup was likely brought to the party specifically for Mrs. Bancroft. As they left the surgery, Raymond regarded his aunt with newfound curiosity. You're really quite involved in this, aren't you, Aunt Jane? One can't help but take an interest when such things happen, practically on one's doorstep, she replied mildly. I wonder if we might stop by the hospital on our way home. There's someone there I should like to speak with. The cottage hospital of St. Mary Mead was a modest affair, recently expanded thanks to the charitable efforts of several local benefactors, including the late Mrs. Bancroft. The head nurse, a practical woman named Matron Ellis, greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of respect and wariness. I understand you wish to inquire about Nurse Fletcher, she said, leading them to her small office. A terrible tragedy, that. Yes, indeed, agreed Miss Marple. Such a young woman. Heart failure, I believe? That was the official cause. Yes, something in Matron Ellis's tone suggested reservation. But you had your doubts? The matron's professional demeanor wavered for a moment. It was all very sudden. She was young, healthy, never any indication of heart trouble, and the circumstances. She trailed off, glancing toward the open door. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I believe Mrs. Bancroft was looking into the matter before her death. Was she indeed? Matron Ellis's eyebrows rose. That explains it then. Explains what, exactly? She came here several times in the weeks before her death. I assumed it was about the new children's wing. She was a major donor, after all, but she asked a lot of questions about Nurse Fletcher. Very specific questions about who was on duty, the night she died, what medications she had access to, and who was on duty that night. Dr. Graham was attending, along with Nurse Collins. It was a quiet night, apparently, until Nurse Fletcher collapsed in the dispensary. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the dispensary would contain various medicines, some potentially dangerous if misused. Naturally, but everything is strictly controlled with detailed records kept of all dispensations. I see, and Nurse Fletcher, was she particularly close to anyone here at the hospital? A shadow crossed Matron Ellis's face. She was engaged to Dr. Graham before he broke it off to marry Lady Westholm's daughter. Caused quite a stir at the time. The poor girl was devastated. As Raymond drove his aunt home, she sat in uncharacteristic silence, her knitting needles still in her lap. You've that look about you, Aunt Jane, he observed. The one that means you're piecing something together. Oh, it's just an old woman's fancies, she demurred, though her eyes held a keen glint that belied her words. But I do think I should pay a visit to Richard Bancroft tomorrow. There's something about that glove that troubles me. The following morning found Miss Marple at the door of the small cottage Richard Bancroft had rented on the edge of the village. He answered her knock with obvious impatience, his handsome features arranged in a scowl that softened only slightly at the sight of the elderly lady. Miss Marple, isn't it? I'm afraid this isn't a good time. I do apologize for the intrusion, she said gently. But I wondered if you might spare me just a few moments. It's about your aunt's death, or more specifically, about a certain glove that was found in the garden. Something flashed in Richard's eyes, alarm quickly masked. I don't see how I can help with that. I don't know anything about any glove. That's precisely what interests me, said Miss Marple. You see, the glove in question is rather distinctive, White kid leather with a pearl button. The curious thing is, I distinctly remember seeing you with a similar glove at the garden party. Richard's face paled. That's absurd. Why would I have a lady's glove? Oh, it wasn't yours, of course. You were holding it for someone, the lady you were conversing with by the rose arbor. She removed her gloves to handle the roses, I recall, and handed them to you. Most gentlemanly of you to assist her. Richard's expression hardened. You're mistaken. Now if you'll excuse me, the poison that killed your aunt, Miss Marple continued, as if he hadn't spoken, was derived from monkshood. A gardener would know how to prepare such a thing, wouldn't they? And Lady Westholme's daughter has quite an interest in gardening, I believe. The door closed with unnecessary force, leaving Miss Marple standing alone on the step. She was not perturbed. In fact, there was a small, satisfied smile playing about her lips as she made her way back through the village. That afternoon, she telephoned Inspector Slack. I believe, she said without preamble, that you should investigate the connection between Richard Bancroft and Lady Westholme's daughter, and perhaps look into the financial arrangements for the new children's wing at the hospital. The inspector's response was predictably dismissive, but Miss Marple was undeterred. She had lived long enough to know that the truth had a way of emerging, particularly when one knew exactly where to look for it. Chapter 4. Secrets of the Blue Teacup. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns across the polished surface of her mahogany table. Before her lay the fragments of a puzzle that refused to assemble itself into a coherent picture. Newspaper clippings concerning Mrs. Bancroft's charitable endeavors, hastily scribbled notes from her conversations with Doctors Haydock and Matron Alice, and at the center of it all, a detailed sketch she had made of the infamous blue teacup, now shattered beyond repair, but indelibly imprinted upon her memory. Miss Marple reached for her magnifying glass, a relic from her father's desk that had served her well over the years. Something about that cup nagged at her consciousness, a half-formed thought that flickered tantalizingly at the edges of her mind like a butterfly, unwilling to alight. The cup had been distinctive, certainly. Fine bone china with a pattern of delicate blue flowers twining around the rim, a gold filigree handle that curved with particular elegance. But there was something else, something significant that hovered just beyond her grasp. The gentle knock at her door provided a welcome interruption to her circular thoughts. Her faithful maid, Cherry, announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Lady Westholme's daughter, Dr. Elizabeth Graham. Elizabeth Graham entered the room with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect. Her tailored suit emphasized her slender frame, and her dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been pretty, were it not for the perpetual tension that drew her features into slightly severe lines. Yet today that habitual composure seemed strained. Beneath the polished exterior lurked a nervousness that manifested in the slight tremor of her gloved hands. Miss Marple, she began, declining the offered seat with a quick shake of her head. I understand you've been asking questions about the circumstances of Mrs. Bancroft's death. One cannot help but be curious. Miss Marple replied mildly, noting with interest that Dr. Graham had chosen to remain standing, a position of perceived advantage perhaps, or simply the restlessness of a troubled mind. Such a tragedy. And at your mother's garden party of all places. Yes, well, that's precisely what I wished to speak with you about. Dr. Graham's gaze fell upon the table with its array of notes and clippings. Her eyes widened fractionally as they landed on the sketch of the teacup. I've heard that people say you have a certain insight into these matters. People are far too generous, Miss Marple demurred, though she made no move to conceal her investigative materials. I'm merely an observant old woman with perhaps too much time on her hands. Nevertheless, Dr. Graham pressed on, I thought you should know that there are certain complications regarding Mrs. Bancroft's death that may not be immediately apparent, such as the origin of her distinctive blue teacup, Miss Marple suggested, watching carefully for the other woman's reaction. The effect was immediate and revealing. Graham's composure fractured momentarily, a flash of something, fear, guilt, crossing her features before she regained control. What do you know about the teacup? She asked, her voice carefully modulated. Only that it seemed quite out of place amidst Lady Westholme's elegant white and gold china service, Miss Marple replied, and that Mrs. Bancroft was not, in fact, drinking from it moments before her collapse. Dr. Graham drew a sharp breath. You noticed that? I notice most things, my dear. It's both the blessing and the curse of old age. One has little else to do but observe the world around one. Miss Marple smiled benignly, the picture of harmless elderly eccentricity. The question that troubles me is not so much where the cup came from, but how it came to contain a lethal dose of aconite. Dr. Graham sank slowly into the chair she had previously declined, the professional composure draining from her face. The cup was mine, she said quietly. Or rather, it belonged to the hospital. It's part of a set we use in the private wing, reserved for our most distinguished patients. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, her knitting needles now in her hands, kicking softly as if their gentle rhythm might provide a comforting backdrop for difficult confidences. Mrs. Bancroft had been making inquiries at the hospital. Dr. Graham continued, her eyes fixed on the hypnotic movement of the knitting needles, about a patient who died under my husband's care, a young nurse named Sarah Fletcher. Yes, I had heard something of the sort, Miss Marple murmured. A tragic case. Heart failure in one so young is always shocking. It wasn't heart failure. The words emerged starkly, hanging in the sunlit room like an unwelcome shadow. At least, that wasn't the whole truth. Nurse Fletcher suffered a reaction to a medication she was given, a medication my husband prescribed. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily before resuming their steady rhythm. A mistake in the prescription? Robert, Dr. Graham insisted it was, a simple error, easily made in the rush of an emergency. A hint of bitterness crept into her voice. But Mrs. Bancroft somehow learned that there had been other similar mistakes in my husband's practice history, previous positions, other hospitals. She was compiling evidence. For what purpose? To prevent him from taking charge of the new children's wing, I believe. She had promised the funding, you see, but she retained the right to approve key appointments. When she learned about Sarah and the others, Dr. Graham's voice faltered. She threatened to withdraw her support, Miss Marple supplied. More than that, she threatened to present her findings to the medical board. Robert would have lost his license. Everything we've worked for. She broke off, fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, neither of us had anything to do with her death. Why would I bring the cup if we had planned to? Again, she stopped abruptly. Indeed, why would you? Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. Unless, of course, the cup itself was not intended to be the vehicle for the poison. Tell me, Dr. Graham, were you aware that your mother and Mrs. Bancroft had been close friends in their youth? The sudden change of subject appeared to disorient Dr. Graham. Yes. I believe they attended the same finishing school, but they had grown apart over the years, different interests, different circles, and yet your mother continued to invite Mrs. Bancroft to her garden party each year. Curious, don't you think, to maintain such a tenuous social connection? Mother has always been meticulous about such things, social obligations, maintaining appearances. Yes, appearances, Miss Marple echoed softly. So important, aren't they? The appearance of a successful marriage, of a distinguished medical career, of a respectable family name unsullied by scandal. She set aside her knitting and leaned forward slightly. Did you know that your mother visited Nurse Fletcher on the night of her death? The color drained from Dr. Graham's face. That's impossible. Mother never mentioned. The night porter's log shows a visitor at an unusual hour. Lady Helena Westholm signed in at 11:42 p.m. Departed at 12:17 a.m. Nurse Fletcher was found collapsed at approximately 12:30. Where did you get this information? Dr. Graham demanded, her professional demeanor now completely abandoned. Matron Ellis has been most helpful. Miss Marple said, once I explained my concerns about Mrs. Bancroft's investigation, she produced the visitor logs for my review. Most illuminating, Doctor. Graham rose unsteadily to her feet. I don't know what you're implying, but my mother would never— I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm merely collecting pieces of a puzzle, the blue teacup that appeared so mysteriously at the garden party. The fact that it was Lady Westholm herself who drew attention to Mrs. Bancroft's collapse, directing all eyes to the distinctive cup that she knew would be associated with her guest. The curious circumstance of the poison being found on a glove that seems connected to both Richard Bancroft and someone in your mother's household. Richard Bancroft, Doctor, Grime repeated, genuine confusion evident in her voice. What has he to do with this? That is precisely what I've been wondering, Miss Marple admitted. His connection seemed tangential at best, a disinherited nephew with an obvious motive, but no apparent means or opportunity. And yet, the glove found in the garden suggests a different narrative. A new voice joined the conversation, startling both women. A narrative of collusion and betrayal, perhaps. Raymond West stood in the doorway, hat in hand, a folded newspaper tucked beneath his arm. Forgive the intrusion, Aunt Jane, but I've just come from the village, and there's been a development I thought you should know about immediately. He nodded politely to Dr. Grammer. Good morning, Doctor. I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial. Not at all, Miss Marple assured him, though her keen eyes noted the visible relief that washed over Dr. Grammer at the interruption. What news do you bring? Raymond extracted the newspaper from beneath his arm and laid it on the table, folded open to reveal a small headline. Hospital Trust announces endowment for Children's Wing. Richard Bancroft named as trustee. It seems, Raymond explained, that in the absence of Mrs. Bancroft's promised funding, a mysterious benefactor has stepped forward to ensure the Children's Wing proceeds as planned. The announcement was made this morning by Lady Westholm herself, with Richard Bancroft at her side. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. Indeed? How very providential. Dr. Grammer had gone very still, her face a mask of suppressed emotion. If you'll excuse me, she said stiffly. I have patients waiting at the surgery. After she had gone, Raymond turned to his aunt with a raised eyebrow. Did I interrupt something significant? On the contrary, dear boy, Miss Marple replied, reaching once more for her knitting. You've provided the final piece of a most intricate puzzle. I believe it's time we paid a visit to Lady Westholm's extensive china collection. The grandeur of Westholm Manor had always impressed visitors, not least for its remarkable collection of fine porcelain displayed in glass-fronted cabinets throughout the drawing room. Lady Westholm received Miss Marple and Raymond with a graciousness that betrayed no hint of discomfort, though her eyes followed Miss Marple's movements with a wariness that spoke volumes to the observant spinster. Such a lovely collection, Miss Marple commented, peering through her spectacles at a particularly fine Wedgwood piece. One develops a certain appreciation for beautiful things over the years, doesn't one? Though I've always found blue and white china particularly charming. Indeed, Lady Westholm agreed, her tone cordial but reserved. The Chinese influence, of course, dating back centuries, one finds it in the most unexpected places. like the teacup that Mrs. Bancroft was using on the day of her death, Miss Marple suggested innocently. Such a distinctive pattern, quite similar to these pieces from your own collection, wouldn't you say? Lady Westholm's hand, reaching to indicate a delicate vase, faltered almost imperceptibly. I couldn't say. I paid little attention to Mrs. Bancroft's personal effects. Curious then that the cup should match so perfectly with your private collection rather than the hospital service, as your daughter believed. Miss Marple moved along the cabinet, pausing before an empty space on one shelf. There appears to be something missing here. A piece away for restoration, Lady Westholm explained smoothly. A small matter of a chipped rim. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, her voice gentle but inexorable, a cup that shattered on your terrace 3 days ago, a cup that you had personally selected from your collection, knowing that Mrs. Bancroft would recognize it immediately, just as she had recognized the distinctive pattern when she saw it in Nurse Fletcher's possession shortly before the girl's death. The silence that followed seemed to expand, filling the elegant room with its oppressive weight. When Lady Westholm finally spoke, her voice held a new quality, a cold, hard edge like steel wrapped in velvet. You have a remarkable imagination, Miss Marple, but imagination is not evidence, as I'm sure Inspector Slack would be the first to remind you. Perhaps not, Miss Marple conceded, but the visitor log at the hospital, showing your late-night visit to Nurse Fletcher, might prove more compelling, as might the letter from Mrs. Bancroft, that I understand was found among the nurse's personal effects, a letter promising to help her expose certain irregularities in Dr. Graham's practice. Lady Westholm's composure did not waver, but something changed in her eyes, a calculation, a reassessment. You seem remarkably well informed for someone with no official capacity in this investigation. Old women hear all sorts of things, Miss Marple replied mildly. People tend to forget we're there, you see, rather like the portrait of your grandmother that hangs in the hallway, always watching, seldom noticed. A thin smile curved Lady Westholm's lips. And what exactly do you imagine you've heard? Miss Marple, that Nurse Fletcher discovered evidence of Dr. Graham's medical negligence, evidence that threatened not only his career, but the reputation of the hospital itself, that she confided in Mrs. Bancroft, who promised to help her bring the truth to light, that both women subsequently died under suspicious circumstances, and that now, mysteriously, the funding for the children's wing has been secured, despite Mrs. Bancroft's death, with your family maintaining control, and Richard Bancroft, a man with gambling debts and financial troubles, suddenly named as trustee. Lady Westholm's gaze shifted to Raymond, then back to Miss Marple. Fascinating speculation, but as I said, without evidence. The evidence, Miss Marple interrupted gently, is currently being examined by Inspector Slack. The poison on the glove matches exactly the rare botanical specimen found in your private greenhouse, the specimen you cultivated yourself, I believe, given your well-known interest in exotic plants. She paused, letting the implications settle in the air between them. So many connections, Lady Westholm, so many threads leading back to a single source. Chapter 5. The Anonymous Letter. A fine rain fell upon St. Mary Mead that evening, veiling the village in a gossamer shroud that softened edges and muffled sounds. Miss Marple sat by her window, the golden circle of lamplight surrounding her like a protective enchantment against the gathering darkness beyond. The ticking of the mantel clock provided a metronomic counterpoint to her thoughts as she contemplated the web of deception and malice that had been woven around 2 deaths. Her conversation with Lady Westholm had left her troubled not merely by the evidence of guilt, but by the absolute composure with which the woman had faced her accusations. There was something chilling in such self-possession, the mark of a mind so convinced of its own superiority that it could not conceive of failure. The soft thud of an envelope being pushed through her letterbox roused Miss Marple from her reverie. Cherry had left for the evening, and Raymond had gone to London to consult some literary agent or other, leaving Miss Marple to her own devices. With a slight sigh for aging joints, she made her way to the hall and retrieved the plain white envelope that lay upon the mat. No address, no stamp, hand-delivered then. The handwriting that spelled out simply, Miss Marple, was unfamiliar, disguised perhaps with each letter carefully formed to reveal nothing of its author. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message composed of letters cut from a newspaper and pasted onto the page with meticulous precision. Look at the hospital records from last August. 6 patients, Ward C. The truth lies in what is missing. Miss Marple returned to her chair, studying the anonymous note with a thoughtful frown. Newspaper clippings, such a theatrical touch, reminiscent of the lurid detective novels her nephew wrote. And yet, there was an urgency to the message that suggested genuine fear rather than melodrama. Someone believed they could not safely speak directly, yet felt compelled to point her toward some crucial evidence. She reached for her telephone and dialed Dr. Haydock's number. When he answered, his voice carried the weariness of a long day's work. "Jane," he greeted her, dispensing with formalities in a way that spoke of their long friendship. "I was just thinking of calling you. There's been a development in the Bancroft case." "The hospital records from last August," Miss Marple said quietly. "Ward C, 6 patients." A startled silence met her words. "How could you possibly—" Dr. Haydock began, then stopped himself. "Never mind. I should know better than to ask by now. Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. Inspector Slack has been making inquiries at the hospital, at my suggestion, and has uncovered something rather disturbing. Perhaps you'd be good enough to tell me about it," Miss Marple suggested, settling more comfortably into her chair. 6 patients on Ward C last August, all under Dr. Graham's care, all presenting with different ailments but similar outcomes. A sudden decline followed by cardiac arrest. All deaths were attributed to complications from their existing conditions, nothing to raise particular alarm when viewed individually, but viewed collectively. Precisely. The pattern becomes apparent. What's more, Slack's discovered that certain pages from the medication logs for those dates appear to have been removed or altered. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the receiver, and Nurse Fletcher would have had access to those records. More than access, she was assigned to Ward C during that period. If she noticed discrepancies, Dr. Haydock let the implication hang in the air between them. She would have been in a position to recognize a pattern that others might miss, Miss Marple concluded, and if she confided her suspicions to Mrs. Bancroft, who was already investigating Dr. Graham's professional history, they both became liabilities. Dr. Haydock finished grimly. "Jane, this goes beyond simple malpractice. If what we suspect is true, we're looking at deliberate—" "Yes," Miss Marple interrupted gently, unwilling to have the words spoken aloud over an unsecured telephone line. "I quite understand, Dr. Haydock. Might I impose upon you for assistance tomorrow? I believe it would be most useful if we could examine those hospital records together." The rain had intensified by morning, drumming against the windows of the cottage hospital with insistent fingers. Miss Marple shook out her umbrella in the entrance hall, noting the hushed atmosphere that seemed more pronounced than the usual reverent quiet of medical institutions. News of Inspector Slack's inquiries had clearly spread, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that manifested in the averted gazes and lowered voices of the staff they passed. Matron Ellis met them in her office, her customary efficiency tempered by evident strain. Dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her usually immaculate uniform showed subtle signs of haste in its arrangement. "I've brought the files you requested, Dr. Haydock," she said, gesturing to a stack of folders on her desk. "Though I'm not entirely comfortable with this, These are confidential patient records. Under normal circumstances, I would entirely respect that confidentiality, Dr. Haydock assured her. But these are not normal circumstances, as I think you well know, matron. A shadow passed across the woman's face. Yes, she admitted quietly. I've been wondering for some time whether I should have asked more questions. About the deaths on Ward C, Miss Marple prompted gently. Matron Ellis looked at her sharply. You know about that? Only what Dr. Haydock has told me. But I understand that Nurse Fletcher may have had concerns about those cases. Sarah was conscientious, Matron Ellis said carefully. Perhaps too conscientious for her own good. She came to me once, asking about discrepancies in the medication logs. I advised her to follow proper channels, to speak with Dr. Graham directly. Her voice faltered. A week later, she was dead, and you never thought to question the circumstances. The autopsy showed natural causes, Matron Ellis replied defensively. Heart failure, congenital defect, undiagnosed. These things happen. Indeed they do, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though it seems a remarkable coincidence that such a defect should manifest fatally, just as Nurse Fletcher was raising questions about irregularities in patient care. Color rose in Matron Ellis's cheeks. Whether from shame or indignation was difficult to discern. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple? I'm not suggesting anything, my dear. I'm merely observing that coincidences, when they accumulate beyond a certain point, tend to form patterns, and patterns once recognized can reveal truths that individual incidents might obscure. Dr. Haydock had been examining the files as they spoke, his frown deepening as he turned the pages. There's something odd here, he murmured. The medication records for patient 4, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, don't match the treatment protocol for her condition. The dosage of digitalis is far higher than would normally be prescribed for a woman of her age and weight. Could it be a transcription error? Matron Ellis suggested. Perhaps. But there's a similar anomaly in patient 2's records. Dr. Haydock looked up, his expression grave. Jane, I think we may need to consult with a pathologist about the possibility of exhumation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I feared as much, but before we take such a drastic step, I wonder if we might speak with Miss Simmons again. Mrs. Bancroft's companion struck me as a woman who notices details, and if Mrs. Bancroft was investigating these deaths, they found Miss Simmons packing the last of her belongings in the small cottage she had temporarily occupied. Her greeting was cool, her manner distracted. I'm leaving for London tomorrow, she explained, folding a blouse with precise movements. My cousin has found me a position as a companion to an elderly lady in Kensington, not as stimulating as working for Mrs. Bancroft perhaps. But beggars can't be choosers. Before you go, Miss Marple said, settling carefully onto the edge of a hard chair. I wondered if you might tell us a little more about Mrs. Bancroft's interest in the hospital, in particular, her investigation into certain deaths that occurred there last August. Miss Simmons' hand stilled on the blouse. How do you know about that? Mrs. Bancroft kept records, I imagine, Miss Marple suggested. Notes, perhaps, or correspondence. The sort of documentation a methodical woman would compile. Yes, Miss Simmons admitted after a moment's hesitation. She was very organized, very thorough. And these records, might they still exist? Miss Simmons glanced toward a small writing desk in the corner of the room. She kept everything in a leather portfolio. I found it among her things afterward. I wasn't sure what to do with it. May we see it? With obvious reluctance, Miss Simmons crossed to the desk and extracted a well-worn leather folder from the bottom drawer. I probably should have given this to Inspector Slack, she said, holding it protectively against her chest. But Mrs. Bancroft was so concerned about discretion, about making absolutely certain before she made any accusations. And then when she died in that horrible way? You feared the same might happen to you. Miss Marple completed the thought gently. Miss Simmons nodded, her composure cracking slightly. It sounds foolish, I know. Not foolish at all, Dr. Haydock assured her. In fact, extremely prudent, given the circumstances. With visible reluctance, Miss Simmons handed the portfolio to Miss Marple. There's a letter in there, she said, quietly. From Nurse Fletcher to Mrs. Bancroft. It came the day after the nurse died. Mrs. Bancroft was devastated when she read it. That's when she decided to change her will, to make sure that Dr. Graham would never head the children's wing. Miss Marple opened the portfolio carefully. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a sealed envelope addressed to Mrs. Bancroft in a neat feminine hand. With a questioning glance at Miss Simmons, who nodded permission, Miss Marple opened the envelope and extracted a single sheet of paper. Dear Mrs. Bancroft, she read aloud. By the time you receive this, I fear I may no longer be able to speak for myself. The evidence I have gathered concerning Dr. Graham's activities is enclosed. 6 patients in Ward C last August, all deliberately administered incorrect medications resulting in death. I believe Lady Westholme is aware of her son-in-law's actions and has been actively concealing them to protect the family reputation. I have placed the original medication logs in safekeeping with a trusted friend. If anything should happen to me, please contact Nurse Collins, who will know where to find them. Yours sincerely, Sarah Fletcher. A heavy silence followed the reading of the letter. It was Dr. Haydock who finally broke it. This is extraordinary, he said. If these allegations are true, I believe we should locate Nurse Collins without delay, Miss Marple suggested, rising from her chair with unexpected briskness. And perhaps it would be wise if Miss Simmons were to accompany us to the police station, where Inspector Slack can ensure her safety until this matter is resolved. As they prepared to leave, a sudden thought occurred to Miss Marple. The anonymous note I received, she said to Dr. Haydock, the one directing us to the hospital records from August. Who else knew that you and Inspector Slack were investigating those specific cases? Dr. Haydock frowned. No one, as far as I'm aware. Slack has been very discreet, and I haven't discussed it with anyone but you. Then our letter writer must be someone inside the hospital, Miss Marple concluded. Someone with access to those records who knows what happened to those patients and who fears they may be implicated if they speak openly. Nurse Collins, Miss Simmons suggested. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. Though one wonders why, if she possesses the original medication logs that could prove Dr. Graham's guilt, she hasn't come forward before now. As they stepped outside into the persistent rain, Miss Marple noticed a familiar figure hurrying along the lane toward them. Richard Bancroft, his collar turned up against the weather, his expression taut with urgency. Miss Marple, he called, quickening his pace. I've been looking for you. There's something you should know about Lady Westholme and that blue teacup. Chapter 6. A Final Cup of Tea. The rain had ceased by late afternoon, leaving behind a landscape washed clean, glistening beneath a tentative sun. Miss Marple's cottage, with its rose garden still beaded with lingering droplets, seemed a haven of tranquility, in stark contrast to the turbulent undercurrents of deception she had uncovered. The delicate china teapot, white with a pattern of forget-me-nots, sat at the center of her polished table, surrounded by cups of identical design. 6 cups, meticulously arranged, awaiting the arrival of 6 individuals whose fates had become inextricably entwined in a tapestry of ambition, fear, and calculated malice. Richard Bancroft had been most insistent when he approached them outside Miss Simmons' cottage. The tautness of his features had softened into something akin to relief upon finding Miss Marple, as though the burden of knowledge he carried had grown too heavy to bear alone. The blue teacup, he had said, his voice low and urgent, was part of a set belonging to my grandmother, Mrs. Bancroft's mother. There were 2 cups originally, both painted with the same distinctive pattern. My aunt kept one. The other was given to Lady Westholme on the occasion of her wedding, many years ago, a symbol of friendship between two young women who had once been inseparable. Now, as Miss Marple adjusted the placement of a silver spoon with exacting precision, she reflected on how such simple objects could contain entire histories within their delicate forms. The blue teacup, a vessel not merely for tea, but for the complex emotions of its owners, friendship, betrayal, and ultimately vengeance. The doorbell chimed softly. Cherry, having returned for the afternoon's unusual gathering, ushered in the first arrivals, Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack, the latter's perpetually furrowed brow suggesting disapproval of this unorthodox approach to criminal investigation. "I still don't see the necessity for this tea party, Miss Marple," the inspector stated, as he reluctantly took the seat indicated. "We have substantial evidence now, thanks to the documents provided by Miss Simmons." "Evidence is not the same as understanding, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "and I have found that certain truths emerge more naturally when people are seated together, engaged in the civilized ritual of taking tea." The doorbell sounded again, heralding the arrival of Lady Westholme and her daughter, Dr. Elizabeth Graham. They entered the modest sitting room with the careful poise of aristocrats finding themselves in unfamiliar territory, though a subtle tension in Lady Westholme's bearing suggested she was not as composed as she wished to appear. "How charming," she remarked, her gaze sweeping over the assembled company before settling on the tea service. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or wariness, crossed her features before vanishing beneath a veneer of social grace. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said, gesturing to the remaining chairs. "We're just waiting for one more guest." As if summoned by her words, the final arrival was announced, Richard Bancroft, accompanied by Miss Simmons, who had evidently decided to delay her departure for London. He nodded curtly to the assembled company, his gaze lingering momentarily on Lady Westholme, with an expression that combined wariness and something more complex, a curious mixture of resentment and reluctant complicity. "Now that we're all here," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with the practiced ease of one who has performed this ritual countless times, "I thought it might be illuminating to discuss the remarkable series of events that began with the death of Nurse Fletcher and culminated in the tragic poisoning of Mrs. Bancroft at Lady Westholme's garden party." Dr. Elizabeth Graham's hand trembled slightly as she accepted her cup, the liquid within oscillating dangerously close to the rim. "I'm not sure what purpose this serves," she said, her professional demeanor strained by evident discomfort. "My husband is not even present to defend himself against these insinuations." "Dr. Graham's absence is indeed notable," Miss Marple agreed, "though perhaps understandable, given the substantial evidence that has come to light regarding his involvement in the deaths of 6 patients under his care at the hospital last August." Lady Westholme set her untouched cup down with deliberate precision. "These are slanderous accusations, Miss Marple. My son-in-law is a respected physician." "Indeed he is," Miss Marple acknowledged, which made it all the more distressing when Nurse Fletcher discovered discrepancies in the medication logs. Discrepancies suggesting that these patients had been deliberately administered fatal doses of various drugs. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "We have the original medication logs now," he informed Lady Westholme. "Nurse Collins came forward this morning after receiving a message that it was safe to do so. The evidence against Dr. Graham is quite conclusive." A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere, an almost imperceptible realignment of tensions as this new information settled among the assembled company. Lady Westholme's posture remained rigidly proper, betraying nothing but her daughter's face had drained of color. "If what you say is true," Lady Westholme said evenly, "then my son-in-law will answer for his actions. But I fail to see how this connects to Mrs. Bancroft's unfortunate death, which was clearly the work of some unknown poisoner at my garden party." "Oh, there was nothing unknown about it," Miss Marple contradicted gently. "The poisoner was quite deliberate in their actions, using a toxin derived from a rare plant species cultivated in your own greenhouse." Lady Westholme's eyes narrowed. "You cannot possibly believe that The blue teacup," Miss Marple continued, as if the interruption had not occurred, "was particularly significant, not merely as a vehicle for the poison, but as a symbol, a reminder of a friendship long since corrupted. Mrs. Bancroft recognized it immediately, didn't she? The cup that had once belonged to her mother, given as a wedding gift to her dearest friend." Richard Bancroft leaned forward slightly. "My aunt told me about it once," he said quietly. "How she and Lady Westholme had been inseparable in their youth. How they had promised to stand by each other, no matter what came. A promise that became inconvenient," Miss Marple observed, "when Mrs. Bancroft discovered that Lady Westholme had been actively concealing her son-in-law's criminal activities that had resulted in multiple deaths, including that of Nurse Fletcher." A tense silence descended upon the room, broken only by the delicate sound of Miss Marple's spoon stirring her tea. Lady Westholme remained perfectly still, her features composed into a mask of dignified indignation that failed to reach her eyes, which had grown calculating. "This is absurd," she finally declared. "You have no proof of such allegations." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, reaching for a folder that lay beside her chair, "we have Mrs. Bancroft's extensive notes, Nurse Fletcher's letter, and the testimony of Miss Simmons regarding Mrs. Bancroft's investigation. We also have the rather curious matter of the poisoned glove found in your garden, a glove that, according to Richard Bancroft, belongs to neither him nor anyone in your household, yet contains traces of the same toxin that killed Mrs. Bancroft." Lady Westholme's gaze flickered briefly toward Richard, a moment of uncertainty crossing her features. "I have no knowledge of any glove." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "I don't believe you do. That particular piece of evidence was, I suspect, intended to mislead the investigation, to direct suspicion toward Mr. Bancroft, with whom you had recently formed a most convenient alliance." Richard Bancroft shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I never agreed to any murder," he muttered, avoiding his aunt's companion's accusing stare. "The arrangement was supposed to be mutually beneficial. I would receive an appointment as trustee of the hospital endowment, and in return, I would support Lady Westholme's version of events at the garden party. By claiming to have seen someone suspicious near the refreshment table," Miss Marple supplied, thus diverting attention from the true poisoner. Inspector Slack's expression darkened. "You deliberately misled a police investigation, Mr. Bancroft." "I needed the money," Richard admitted, his facade of aristocratic composure crumbling. "My business is failing, and after Aunt Agatha changed her will, Lady Westholme approached me the day after the garden party. She said she could arrange for me to be named trustee of the hospital endowment, with all the financial benefits that entailed. All I had to do was corroborate her account of a stranger lurking near the tea service." Lady Westholme rose abruptly from her chair, her composure finally fracturing. "This is preposterous. You have no tangible evidence connecting me to any poisoning." "Perhaps not directly," Miss Marple conceded, "but the circumstantial evidence is quite compelling. The poison derived from a plant in your greenhouse, the deliberate use of the blue teacup, a psychological touch that suggests someone with an intimate knowledge of Mrs. Bancroft's history, the careful planning required to switch the cups at precisely the right moment, something only someone familiar with the garden party's arrangements could accomplish." Elizabeth Graham, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mother, please, tell them it isn't true." Lady Westholme turned to her daughter, something softening briefly in her expression. I did what was necessary to protect our family, Elizabeth. Your husband may have made errors in judgment, but exposing him would have destroyed everything we've built. The Westholm name, the hospital position, your marriage, all of it would have crumbled. So you silenced Nurse Fletcher, Miss Marple said quietly, when she threatened to expose Dr. Gramay's actions. And when Mrs. Bancroft continued the investigation, discovering the truth about both deaths, she too became a threat that needed to be eliminated. Lady Westholm's lips curved in a smile entirely devoid of warmth. You present an interesting narrative, Miss Marple, but as I said before, narrative is not evidence. Perhaps not, Inspector Slack interjected, rising from his chair. But it's enough to justify a more formal investigation. Lady Westholm, I must ask you to accompany me to the station for questioning. For a moment it seemed Lady Westholm might refuse. Her gaze traveled around the circle of faces, her daughter's stricken expression, Richard Bancroft's thinly veiled relief, Miss Simmons' quiet satisfaction, before finally settling on Miss Marple, who regarded her with the compassionate but unflinching observation of one who has witnessed the full spectrum of human frailty. You underestimated her, you know, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Bancroft, you saw her as she had been in your youth, idealistic, trusting, perhaps a little naive, but she had grown into a woman of remarkable perception and moral courage. Something flickered in Lady Westholm's eyes, a brief acknowledgement perhaps, or simply the final calculation of a mind accustomed to assessing advantage. Without another word she turned and moved toward the door, her posture still impeccable, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. As Inspector Slack followed her out, Dr. Haydock turned to Miss Marple with quiet admiration. How did you know it was her, Jane? What was the crucial piece that convinced you? Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the tea service, the 6 cups arranged in their perfect circle, a microcosm of the human drama that had played out around them. It was the teacup itself, she replied. The deliberate symbolism of it using an object that represented a shared history, a bond of friendship that had been betrayed. Only someone with both a deep personal connection to Mrs. Bancroft and a theatrical sense of justice would have orchestrated such an elaborate means of silencing her. Lady Westholm didn't merely want Mrs. Bancroft dead, she wanted her to know in her final moments exactly who had condemned her and why. As twilight descended upon St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across Miss Marple's garden, the gentle rhythm of village life gradually reasserted itself. Tragedy had visited their community, revealing the darkness that can lurk beneath the most respectable facades. But justice, in its quiet, methodical way, had prevailed, and Miss Marple, returning to her knitting by the fireside, reflected that while human nature remained constant in its capacity for both terrible cruelty and remarkable courage, there was comfort in knowing that truth, however deeply buried, would eventually find its way into the light.